welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and I'm really excited to chat with this guest today because, as I just mentioned, this is her debut novel, This Cursed House, and I devoured it. It was amazing. I read it in 2 days, and I rarely do that anymore because I constantly have kids interrupting me. So yeah, it was great. And I cannot wait to talk to you about it. So please introduce yourself to us and tell us about This Cursed House.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Sandeen, and This Cursed House is my debut novel. It is a Southern Gothic horror, and the protagonist is Jemma Barker. She's a 27-year-old young Black woman. She moves from Chicago down to New Orleans. She accepts a job offer from a family in New Orleans the family name is the Duchons. And Jemma has reasons for wanting to leave Chicago. So this job offer comes at the perfect time for her. She is desperate to get away, and she looks at it as her chance for a fresh start. Jemma has always been able to see spirits. However, this is not a gift that she's embraced. And over the course of the novel, it's something that Jemma has to come to terms with as she learns more about the family and her place, within her new environment. And once she learns that the family is cursed, part of her figuring out how to help them is coping with some of her own issues. So that's basically the gist of it.
Yeah, and I think, without giving too much away, the other part of it is like, does she want to help them?
Right.
Because the Duchon really, really complicated in ways that will just spoil the entire story if I start talking about it. It's really just a great story, a really interesting look at the time period, because we're talking like civil rights time period as well. And at the same time, it's like the Civil War is a lot closer to that time period. I mean, obviously it's still close, but back then, it was a lot closer to that time period. And all of that kind of comes into play as Jemma comes to this house. She thinks she's going to be a tutor for a child. And it's just like the craziest bait and switch ever, because there are no children. Everybody in town seems to want to tell her not to go to this house, but she needs a job. The pay is really good, and this is where she ends up. So I guess, this is a standard question, but I really want to know where this story began for you.
Well, I know writers get asked a lot, like, where do you get your ideas? And I think for a lot of us, sometimes we're doing something very random, washing the dishes, taking a walk, playing with the dog. An idea can just pop up in your head. This was I think probably the only time that didn't happen for me. I had just finished another project, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to write next. So I was just sitting down thinking, but what do I want to write about? What am I going to do? And the first thing that popped into my head was cursed family. So I knew I wanted to write about a cursed family. That was all I knew right then. And bits and pieces, eventually came together from different places. One of my biggest inspirations was the film Eve's Bayou, which is also set during that time period, the early 60s in Louisiana. And I just kind of felt like, well, if I could write a story that had that same kind of atmospheric feel, the same vibe, the Southern Gothic, weave through it. I would love that. So, I've said this book is kind of like my love letter, to Eve's Bayou. But my family, I also have like a familial connection to like one of the biggest themes in the book, which is colorism, because the Duchons, they're black, but they're very light. They're white presenting, whereas Gemma, she's a young black woman, she looks black, she's black presenting. And as a result, the Duchons, because they are pretty colorist, they are not, nice to Gemma. And the reader's note in the advanced reader's copy, that a lot of people got, I went into it, and it was just basically my paternal grandmother. She grew up in the segregated South. And one of the things that she wanted to learn how to do was use a sewing machine. And this was something that they taught the girls at school. But because my grandmother's teacher was a light-skinned woman and my grandmother was brown-skinned, and the teacher only favored the light-skinned girls, she only allowed the light-skinned girls in the class to use the small number of sewing machines they had. So everyone didn't even get to take a turn. She just allowed the students that she favored, to learn. So my grandmother never did learn how to use a sewing machine, and I felt like that was, just cruel and, unnecessary. So yeah, those were like the two biggest, inspirations for me.
There's a refrain in the book, like a saying that keeps coming up again that Gemma's heard. What is it? White is all right.
If you're light, you're all right. If you're
Yeah.
brown, stick around. If you're black, stay back. And that was something that my dad told me that he heard growing up, because he grew up during that same, time period. So this was like before, the Black Power movement, where, people were, embracing being black and being proud of that. So yes, that was something that my dad told me. And so that's where I got that from.
I found just the whole the theme of colorism. I mean, again, I don't want to give too much away, but it's just so insidious, just sort of how the Duchons, I guess, how they really just, I don't like not accepted it. They really, they really kind of, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? They really leaned into it, but they
Yes.
didn't see it as an issue. Like for them, it was like, this is just how it is. I mean, they
Mhm.
would say that they were proud of being colored, or, but I mean, it was obvious that that was very specific, that the color they were proud of being was light skinned, white presenting. And when you
Right.
hear just more about the history of the family, and when Gemma just starts digging into things and to what end they were willing to go to make sure that the Duchons presented as white,
Yes.
was wild. And there's the ghosts that are the actual ghosts and spirits in the family, and the ones that Gemma sees, and the supernatural curse. And then there's the rest of the ghosts, the living ghosts that are
Yes.
haunting the house, and the past that everybody just sort of accepts as like, well, yeah, no, we're proud of this very particular thing, but also let's just be very frank that if you're darker skinned than us, we're not going to treat you the same way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So each of the characters were really interesting as well. Did you do some research about families in the Deep South that were white presenting? Just some of the like, was there some historical people that kind of came into it?
I'm not going to say that it was based on anyone specific, but particularly in New Orleans and in Charleston, South Carolina, the antebellum period, in particular, well, even actually during the slavery, era as well, there were, in New Orleans, they called free people of color, and they were like the Duchons, um, for the most part. had very, European characteristics. So in those two particular cities, probably, more so, it was very recognized, in New Orleans and Charleston. That was a very, I would say, not uncommon thing, to see families like that. And some of those families even, they, enslaved people, and things like that. So yeah, it was not based on any particular family, any specific family, but it was definitely based on families, that did exist, during that time period. And I did a little bit of research, but there was one book that I read years ago called The Sweeter the Juice by, I believe the author's name, and it's a nonfiction book, Shirley Taylor Hazlitt, I believe that's her name. And the title came from the saying, the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. And her family, back in the day, basically this mother and the father, I think they had 4 children. 2 of them were light enough to pass for white, and 2 of them weren't. So the parents, because they were also very light, they took the 2 lighter children and moved away and to start a new life as a white family and left the 2 darker, children behind. And she wrote in the book how eventually 2 of the sisters, found each other, but like decades passed, between that time. So yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Geez, wow. I wanted to talk about the curse itself.
Hmm.
So the Duchons cannot leave their house,
Hmm.
and one of them dies every 7 years. So
Right.
the nature of curses, how did you hatch out how that curse was going to work?
That actually was one of the first, I don't know, was one of the easiest things, one of the first things that I was able to figure out. It was just trying to figure out, I guess, the rest of the story around it, how to make the story work. So I don't want to give too much away, but the date that they die on is a specific date. And there's a reason for that date, as Gemma finds out, as the reader, eventually finds out. But I definitely wanted to make the curse serious enough, for them to really need the help, but also like I guess one of the blurbs says that if Gemma cannot, figure out how to break the curse, her fate is tied into the families somehow, some way, which again, anyone who's read it, will discover. But besides that specific curse, I've always said the Duchon family, they are cursed in more ways than one. It's like that is not the only curse affecting them for sure.
Oh, definitely. And it was really intriguing unwrapping that and how many ways they were cursed. The idea of seeing spirits and how that tied into who Gemma was that always part of her character?
It definitely was. And like I said, Gemma grew up not embracing that ability because her parents basically tried to, try to like not beat it out of her, but, did not want her, to use it. But eventually that ability, she needs to see it as less of a curse and more of a gift because it is very instrumental in helping her and helping the Duchamp family.
Yeah, and it's one of the first things you learn about Gemma is that it was considered almost a curse from her parents. It was the devil's work, and it
Hmm.
was something she was supposed to shun. And it was, just a big part of who she was. And I know we just very briefly touched on it also, but Gemma herself is haunted by some stuff that happened where she's from, Chicago, and she's used
Hmm.
to kind of a different, like the North and South way of the civil rights movement was very, it seemed to be very different right immediately. She gets to New Orleans and people are kind of talking about sit ins as though, something like a little bit more in a more fearful way, and she's
Mhm.
got this, like, well, good for them attitude about it. In terms of that, again, like, did you, I mean, obviously, you have, family who was from that time period. Did you talk to or do just general research just about, how things were looked at differently? Because, I mean, north or south, it was dangerous to stir up
Right,
trouble. Like, that's the thing. And I think, like, that's kind of something a lot of times people don't realize is, like, just because things seems to be going differently, or they seems to be a little bit better in the north, and people just assumes, like, okay, well, the north was, the union, and they abolished slavery first. Well, clearly it's going to be better, but that's not really the case. It was just different and maybe hard in other ways.
right.
So if you wanted to just talk a little bit about that.
I did some research, but at the same time, that was just something that I grew up hearing about, reading about. So I was very familiar, with just, the civil rights movement and how things were. And I mean, the big thing, like you pointed out, yes, there was racism in the North and there was racism in the South. It was just, I think, more subtle in the North. Whereas, you didn't necessarily have, a white fountain versus, a fountain for Black people to use. But there were certain places where certain neighborhoods where Black people could not live, definitely could not buy homes. So there were differences, the ism is still there. It's just treated, differently. And yes, Gemma definitely had an adjustment just even on her train ride down south because, she starts off in Chicago. She's not in a car that's marked, quote unquote colored, but that sign eventually gets put in there, and that, so it's not just, it's not just the southern weather and the humidity. It's also her, not freely being able to move about. There are certain neighborhoods where she would feel safer and just certain places where she's just not welcome to be. So yeah, I mean I think anyone, no one ever said that there was no racism in the North. It was just handled differently, than it was in the South. And for Gemma, that was yet another adjustment that she had to get used to.
This book was also really scary. I give you so much credit. You just wrote the tension so well. It was wonderful.
Thank
I
you.
just loved it. And it was very much, I got like the Get Out vibes from it a bit. I suppose, social horror is a term we use a lot, but most of the time it's contemporary. I would say this is historical social horror in the best way, because everything just unravels, and you're unraveling it with Gemma, and you're horrified with her, and you come to the end of the book, and I mean, I really felt like you were there with her. Again, I
Mhm.
don't want to give away what happens at the end of the book, but when I got there, I was just like standing next to her, and I was like, okay, we're here. So thank you so much. It really was great. How did you start writing in general?
Oh, thank you again, Jessica. I've always been a huge reader, and I started off like a lot of young girls growing up in the 70s. I read a ton of Judy Blume, but soon after that, I moved into Stephen King, and I know that seems like a weird jump, but I was I think about 10 or 11 years old, and I was like, well, this is what I want to do. I want to grow up, and I want to write books. It did take, it was not a straight path for me because even though This Cursed House is my debut novel, it is not the first manuscript that I finished. And before my current agent, I had two other agents, and I went out on sub three different times with some previous manuscripts. So this was actually the sixth and a half, and I say six and a half because there was a novella thrown in there, but this was actually the six and a half manuscript that I finished. So yeah, I've done a lot of writing for online publications, and that has, been primarily what I've been writing. And I had some short fiction published within the past several years. I also wrote three young adult educational books. But this is, so I've been writing for a while, have always loved it, through the ups and the downs. But yeah, so this is how I got here.
And lastly, because I did kind of touch upon the end of the book, there's a really interesting theme of forgiveness in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm curious how that theme came up in a book about such heavy topics where, you read about some of the things that happened and you're just like, can you, is this forgivable?
Mm-hmm.
Does what is it? There's this refrain that I've been hearing a lot recently, just, does everybody really deserve a redemption arc? So I did want to ask you about that a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say, even though this is a horror novel, yes, there are other themes in there, like family, forgiveness, acceptance. And forgiveness was definitely one of yeah, that was pretty much there from the beginning. And think, I definitely feel like, and I always love it if readers have different opinions on, like big themes in a book. Some people are going to think, well, I could forgive this. Maybe I need some time. While other people are going to think, well, no, this is, completely unforgivable. And it just depends on who the reader is, their personal experiences and, where they've come from. And so I don't think there is a single right answer. In terms of this particular story, though, forgiveness was extremely important, not just the giving, but also the asking. And yeah, it's like, I did talk to someone and, about the story, and it was very interesting to me that one of the scenes toward the end where Jemma is interacting with the Duchons, something that the grandmother says on Irene, he interpreted he interpreted it one way, which was not how I saw it at all. And I thought it was so interesting. And just to see that, wow, someone can read this and have a completely different view, of this one thing that was said. So that to me, I think is, I don't know, just one of like the best things about books, depending on where we come from and our background, we can see things completely differently, and it's still all valid, and it's still all good.
Thank you so much. Read This Cursed House. It's really, really good. Are you going to go back to like an old manuscript, or are you going to try something else after this? Do you have another novel that you are working on?
Okay, so I do have some old manuscripts. I don't know if I'm going to go back to any of them. There are definitely a couple that I would like to revisit, but I'm currently working on a new idea with Berkeley. So I'm in the process of writing that. And I've got several more ideas that I want to get to. So I don't know when I'll be able to go back to those old manuscripts, but I'm just happy to have, like several ideas in the works. So yes.
Thank you so much. This was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. Our guest today was
Del Sandeen.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.